Professors FM.
Welcome to a very special episode of Why This Universe, where today we finally get to the question, why this universe? Today we are discussing the philosophical question of why does our universe exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? And joining us for this conversation is none other than esteemed physicist, philosopher Sean Carroll. So stick around. You're listening to Why This Universe, a podcast where we break down the biggest ideas in physics. I'm Shalma Wegsman.
And I'm Dan Hooper. We have a very special treat for you today. We're going to talk about some pretty heavy questions in philosophy on this episode, namely the question of why there is something instead of nothing. To wrestle with this hefty question, we have here to help us none other than Sean Carroll. Sean, as I'm sure many of you already know, is a cosmologist and a philosopher of science at Johns Hopkins University. He's also an extremely prominent public intellectual. He hosts this great podcast called Mindscape. And he's the author of some of my favorite books about physics, including From Eternity to Here, The Particle at the End of the Universe, The Big Picture, Something Deeply Hidden, and most recently a series of books called The Biggest Ideas in the Universe. So we're really thrilled that Sean agreed to come on our show. And with that, Sean, welcome to Why This Universe.
Thanks very much for having me.
I've been a big fan of your science and your, let's say, popularization of science for a long time, Sean. So this is great. I want to start with just a question so in my experience, and maybe you have the same experience, it's not particularly common for professional physics researchers to have a lot of interest in philosophy, or at least to spend a lot of their time and energy wrestling with questions of philosophy. And so we're both, significant outliers in this regard. Have you always been interested in philosophy? Is it something you came to later in life?
Always is a tough word to use for a professional cosmologist, as you know. But since I was an undergraduate in college, I was interested in philosophy. I went to Villanova as an undergrad, and they're still an old-time Catholic school, or they were when I was there anyway, that had a huge number of required courses. Every student in arts and sciences had to take 3 semesters of philosophy.
Wow.
In addition to their 3 semesters of religious studies.
Okay.
Plus a whole bunch of social sciences and humanities courses also. So I was forced to take it, but I was intrigued. I wasn't against it. And I fell in love right away. But that's almost, not the right answer to the question, because even though I fell in love right away, the kind of philosophy I liked was moral and political philosophy, John Rawls and people like that.
Sure.
The philosophy of science that I did was fine. It was interesting, but it wasn't like my thing. It wasn't until I was a professor many years later that I realized that many of my cosmological questions and physics questions were being partly addressed by philosophers because I care about the bigger questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the past different from the future? And so I discovered this group of we don't really say so much philosophers of science so much as people working on the foundations of physics.
Sure.
And what we're now trying to rebrand as natural philosophy. So I think that since I realized that was true, I was like, these are my people, and I want to, talk to these folks.
It's a small crew, though, right? I mean, for every one of those, there's many hundred actual just physicists, as opposed to the natural philosopher type of physicists. Yeah.
It is very, very small. It's a respectable thing to do within philosophy. I had Tim Maudlin, who is an example of this kind of person, on my podcast, and I said, do you have trouble convincing your colleagues that what you do is interesting and important? And he says, not my philosophy colleagues. No, they get it. It's the physicists who resist. And I think that's kind of an interesting question as to why that is true. Physicists are trained to get to the answer and, trained to be very practical about things. Like, what's the experiment? What's the data? What can I do? Even if a question is really, really interesting, like what happens when the quantum wave function collapses? if they can't think of a way to experimentally test it, they kind of pretend that it's not interesting.
Right.
And the philosophers have no such compulsions.
Physicists also, I mean, there are notable exceptions, but physicists tend on average to be pretty arrogant about them in their field. And
you've noticed that?
Yeah. And, we might look at a problem that is outside of our domain, and because it's not physics, we think it must be trivial. And nothing could be further from the truth, of course.
That's right. Any physicist, just given 15 minutes of spare time, could solve all the problems of philosophy. And I've literally had physicists say that unironically, like, yeah, I was wondering about the measurement problem of quantum mechanics. So, like, I gave myself an afternoon and I solved it. So, it's an attitude.
All right. So the question we're going to ponder today is why there is something rather than nothing. Before we get into, your own thoughts on this question, can you maybe set the table? Like, what have philosophers historically had to say about this question? Who were the main themes? What were the main ideas out there? Set us up for the question.
Yeah, of course, people have always had origin stories, right? We've all either taught or taken or heard about some history of cosmology class where you start with Babylonian creation myths and come up to the present day. So in some sense, all of these are trying to understand, why is there something rather than nothing? Why was the universe created? And back in the day, it would have been some mythological explanation. Once science comes along and provides explanations for, why the planets move in the way they do, et cetera, much more impersonal, right? There are equations, there are forces, there are laws of physics that explain these things. How do you transfer that question of why the universe itself exists to this context of equations and laws of physics and so forth? And the answer is we still don't have a once and for all final answer to this. Opinions differ. The first very serious quasi-modern exploration was by none other than Gottfried Leibniz, co-inventor of calculus, bitter rival of Isaac Newton. One of Isaac Newton's many bitter rivals, I should say. He wasn't the only one.
He wasn't a popular guy.
Yeah. So Leibniz called it the primordial existential question. Why is there anything at all? And other people up to the present day, Derek Parfit is a famous recent philosopher, just passed away a few years ago, who wrote very influential work on this. So we're still banging our heads against it. But look, the basic idea has been to try, if you can't just say that God or gods did it, to identify some feature of the universe that makes it more likely to exist than not. Right. Either it's simpler for the universe to exist than not, or it's more natural, or there are more ways to exist than to not, something like that. I'm not especially impressed with any of these attempts, but that's been the most common strategy.
Okay, so people have been wrestling with this since, time immemorial, but in a kind of modern context since people like Leibniz and whatever. Let's go up to the current date and let's talk about your own thoughts on this question. So you wrote this paper in 2018 with the title, Why Is There Something Rather Than Nothing? And you kind of offer a position or a attempt to answer this question. Walk us through the contours of your position on this question.
First, I just want to say, finally, the Why This Universe podcast gets to address this question of why this universe exists. So I'm glad that we're able to do that.
Or even why there's any universe at all.
It's been a big warm up, but we're finally reaching
the natural pairing.
I think that this is where philosophy comes in, because you're not going to answer this question by doing better physics. People like Stephen Hawking or plenty of other people who we know and are friends with have thought about the origin of the universe in the context of some physical theory, right? Whether it's quantum gravity, wave function of the universe, or what have you. But none of that explains why that theory of quantum gravity is true, why there is quantum gravity, why there is a universe at all. And in fact, I think that the mistake we're making is that we are taking a very naturally formed English sentence, why is X true, and imagining that it can apply to contexts outside where it makes sense. When I say, why was I late for work this morning? And the answer is, there was traffic. there's a very clear and quantitative understanding of causality in situations like that. And it's not straightforward, right? You really need to think about different possible worlds and counterfactuals. And you say, assigning blame for me being late to the existence of traffic is implicitly imagining there could have been another world where there wasn't traffic and I would have been on time, etc. So answering why questions happens under certain circumstances. And my attitude is that why the universe exists is just not one of those circumstances. There's no sort of sensible set of other possible worlds in which the universe doesn't exist, because if the universe didn't exist, then there wouldn't be a world like that, right? Yeah. The whole sort of context breaks down. So my answer, as unsatisfying as it is to some people, is the existence of the universe is not the kind of thing for which we should expect there to be a reason why.
Okay, so your answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing is that's in some sense not a legitimate question to ask.
It's just the way it is. Yes,
just
that's
the way
right.
it is.
There are going to be, at the end of the day, some brute facts. And the existence of the universe is one of them. Yep.
Good. So are there, just to help us wrap our heads around this notion of a brute fact, are there other examples of brute facts that you can think of? Like what are other, is this the only brute fact, or are there other things that we can point to and say that's definitely a brute fact of nature?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I would say two things. Number one, there almost certainly are other brute facts. Number two, we don't know what they are. Because, as physicists, of course, it's perfectly respectable for us to ask why questions. Why are there more baryons than antibaryons in the universe, right? Why is the universe approximately homogeneous and isotropic? That's perfectly sensible. But we need to be open to the possibility that the answer is that's just the way it is, right? Why is space-time four-dimensional? Why are there three gauge forces, including plus gravity, right? Maybe there are answers to those questions, and we should absolutely look for them. But then when we find that answer, there's going to be other brute facts about, well, why was the universe that way? As long as you can imagine other possible worlds in which things are different, then the fact that our possible world, our actual world, is this way is ultimately answerable only to some set of brute facts, even though we don't yet know what are the brute facts and what are derivable from other things.
Would you consider something to be a brute fact if you could attribute that fact to some other further reasons? Like, could it still be a brute fact if it's also follows from something else?
Well, I think there can be circles, right? I mean, there can be situations where if you give me X, then I can derive Y and Z. But likewise, if you gave me Y, I could derive X and Z, right? And the whole thing. There's some brute fact in there that you need to start with from which you can derive everything else. But there's no way of conceiving it where there aren't any brute facts at all. So you can't say what the brute facts specifically are, but you can say that there are brute facts. So if you have a situation where a purported brute fact is explicable in terms of something else, if it's not that kind of circular dependence, then yeah, that's not a brute fact anymore. That has a better explanation in something more primitive.
And what about like mathematical truths, facts, things that are, I guess, necessarily true by the dictates of logic or just reasoning? These are a different category, right?
To me, they're a different category. And I will try to be very cautious here because I have enormous respect for people who have a deep understanding of the foundations of mathematics. And that set of people does not include myself. It's wild territory out there, and I get lost very, very easily. But my rough idea is that the structure of mathematical logic, not mathematical truths, because the truths sort of depend on what axioms you choose, right? But the structure of starting from the axioms and deriving theorems, et cetera, that's more or less universal. That is, like you said, sort of a necessary kind of thing. So there is no possible world in which, number one, you accept the ordinary axioms of piano arithmetic, and number two, 2 + 2 = 5, right? There are other possible worlds in which you accept other axioms or whatever, but given those axioms, the results follow. I don't think that's something that is optional. I think that's necessary.
So that makes them, pulls them out of the brute fact category. It puts them in this necessary fact category.
That's right. So brute facts in my mind are ones that are contingent, that could have been otherwise. And I don't think that the mathematical theorems count.
Does, the stuff that Kurt Gödel had to say about mathematics, the incompleteness theorems and everything, does this give us a loophole a little bit? Does it open some room for mathematical facts being brute facts?
Well, Gödel thought it did. I am not so sure. I mean, well, I should say that Gödel was a mathematical realist, like many mathematicians are. Here is something that is one of the reasons why mathematical logic makes me lose sleep at night. There was this old project, that was sort of formalized by David Hilbert and that Gödel overturned, which is, let's find the correct axioms of mathematics, and then we can prove all the correct theorems, right?
Yeah.
And what you eventually realize is that given any one set of axioms, like the piano axioms for arithmetic, you can have what are called different models of those axioms. So you can have the same set of axioms giving you two different sets of numbers with two different sets of elements, right? There are these things, I forget what they're called, but there's the natural numbers, and then there's, these extra numbers that you get in different models of arithmetic. And so there's a certain attitude that says, yes, but I know what the real numbers are, not the real in the sense of continuum, but the actual correct numbers are, right? And it turns out, part of this set of ideas that Gödel set in motion says you can't axiomatize that. You can't come up with a set of axioms that uniquely picks out the numbers that you think of as the natural numbers, at least not within first order logic. So therefore, there's a mathematical realist point of view that says, but I know what they are, therefore, since I know what they are, there's something that goes beyond the axioms and the models. There's just truth out there. I don't believe in that either. I think that, that's kind of a wishful thinking kind of thing. I don't need to believe it. I don't see what is the goal of believing that.
Yeah, it ties into that interesting question of, is mathematics invented or discovered? Right?
Yes, that is a very interesting question, and I'm going to stop talking about it because this is stuff I don't really understand at a very deep level. I very much encourage you to get a good philosopher of mathematics on the show because they will blow your mind. Yeah,
that would be a great idea. I read books on this subject and do not feel I have my opinions figured out yet. It's pretty deep. Yeah. So, Sean, let me put you in an awkward position and just ask, are there contemporary philosophers out there who would completely object to your position on this question of why there's something rather than nothing? Like, if I wanted to find the credible person who most aggressively disagreed with you, what would they have to say? What would they push back against?
Yeah, look, my joke is if you get three philosophers in a room, they will not agree that there are three philosophers in the room. Okay, like philosophers are really good at disagreeing on things. Fascinatingly, David Chalmers and David Bourget have done a survey of professional philosophers, and so you can go online and find answers to the question, "What do philosophers believe?"
Okay.
About different things, and the biggest single consensus is the existence of the world, in the sense that not why it exists, but that it exists. And that's like 90%. There's still a healthy 10% that are skeptical about the existence of the world. But any other more contentious question, like why is there something rather than nothing, there will be a diversity of opinion, absolutely. And like I said, generally those people are going to want to say there is a reason why the universe exists, in the sense that it's better, according to some criterion, for the universe to exist than to not exist. And I just think that's kind of begging the question. So why is that the criterion? Like, you just pushed it back a level, but you invented a criterion. And I don't think that reduces the number of brute facts that you have to appeal to.
I guess the brute fact then becomes the criterion, right? That you've just moved it back to there.
Exactly. I mean, Leibniz famously explored the idea. It's unclear the extent that he believed it, but he explored the idea that this is the best of all possible worlds, right? And that's related to the fact that he was interested in why the world exists at all.
But even that only explains, even if you accept the premise that this is the best of all possible worlds and that is why it exists, it tells you why this one exists, not why any at all exists. Well, it doesn't even get you there.
Yeah, and it doesn't even tell you why the best world should exist. Who
Right,
cares?
sure.
This is
Yeah.
the best world.
So, for years, I taught a class at the University of Chicago that I developed called Philosophical Problems in Cosmology. And one of the things I would do in that class is I'd assign your 2018 paper on this. But then I would also have them read something by Lawrence Krauss and his opinions on this, and maybe David Albert and what he had to say about it. And we'd have a good old fashioned 2 or 3 day debate in class about it. Can you comment on the ideas that Lawrence and David have put out on this question, and maybe tell us where you agree and where you disagree about how they think about why there's something rather than nothing?
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward, actually. Lawrence, like most of the book is based on kind of wisecrack by Frank Wilczek. there's something rather than nothing because nothing is unstable. But if you go to the context that Wilczek was saying that, it wasn't about the existence of the universe. It was about the matter-antimatter asymmetry. He wasn't even talking about the existence of the universe. So this idea that, modern science has explained the existence of the universe because nothingness is unstable. Number one, entirely bogus. Mm-hmm. Number two, why is nothing unstable? Like, you still have a brute fact that you're trying to explain. You haven't really done that. And so Lawrence wrote the book mostly because he gave a talk that appeared on YouTube and was super successful. And so I think that they probably threw a buttload of money at him to write the book. But he didn't get into the philosophical investigations of this question in any serious way. And so David Albert, who is a philosopher of physics, reviewed the book, let us say uncharitably, or at least not positively, in the New York Times book review, and just pointed out exactly what we've been saying. Like, this is not the question. Some dynamics of the quantum vacuum state does not address the question, why is there a quantum vacuum state at all? So, right. Have fun. By all means, do good cosmology, but don't pretend you're answering the primordial existential question in Leibniz's sense.
I think also, Lawrence was tied up in this whole anti-theism, activism. And, one of the hardest things to answer if you are going to live in a universe without, God is, why is there anything at all? I mean, to me, God doesn't answer that question either, because you have to ask why God exists, so you're just pushing it back one level. But, I think the, anti-theism advocates would like to have an answer to this question. So Lawrence came up with one, even if it's pretty shallow from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right in terms of the sociology of the time. And, it's a little disappointing to me because I'm on the non-theistic side.
Sure.
But a lot of the people who are on that side, accepted this very cheap and easy witticism as an answer to this deep philosophical question, which is too bad. But I think it's important to point out, as you say, the theists claim to have an answer to why there is something rather than nothing, because everything in the world needs a reason why, except God,
right,
because
right.
God is a necessary being. But, the answer to that is really simple, and it is kind of a simple wisecrack, which is no. God is not a necessary being. There you go. I have refuted the argument, right? If you try to ask, why is God a necessary being, it always begs the question. It always comes back to assuming that there has to be a reason why. You're assuming from the start there are no brute facts, and you're led to posit a necessary being to help explain everything else. But if you're happy with brute facts, your route to answering the question is actually much more direct.
So, Sean, I have one more question for you, and then I'll let you go. Is it possible, even hypothetically, can you wrap your head around the possibility that one day we could discover something, a reason, a principle, or maybe some measurement or something that explained why there's something rather than nothing, moving this brute fact out of that category into either some sort of necessary truth category or contingent with a different kind of explanation? Could this happen, or is this fundamentally brute fact forever, no matter what happens?
I'm happy and willing to be wrong and have my mind changed, but my current answer is this is never going to stop being a brute fact. This is exactly the kind of thing that, you can trade off one brute fact for another, but you're just chasing your tail a little bit. And exactly like I said, as long as I think I can imagine the universe not existing, then the fact that the universe exists is a brute fact. Now, the one shred of daylight there is maybe I'm fooling myself when I say I can imagine the universe not existing, right? Like maybe it's simply incoherent to imagine that the universe didn't exist. I'm not sure. Like that's another like nightmare fuel kind of scenario. Like I just start going in circles and move on with my life. But maybe some more philosophically sophisticated person than myself could develop that into an actual answer to the question.
It's almost like not possible to ask the question if there isn't a universe, right? You can only ask why does something exist if something exists, and if nothing exists, you can't ask any questions about it, you know?
Yeah, no, that's perfectly fair. And, it's actually, even though this is very, very philosophical and removed from tangible worries about the world, it's not that much removed from down-to-earth questions in Bayesian reasoning about old evidence. Right? How much should we update our beliefs based on things that we've always known? Right. This is very important to things like the anthropic principle. Like a lot of modern discussions of the anthropic principle ask you to pretend you don't know that you exist, that you are a human, that that we live on the earth and we go around the sun. And then imagine what we would be like if we'd forgotten all those things. And then we remember all those things and we act surprised. And it's not at all clear that any of that makes any sense. So I don't say it in a disparaging way. I think these are very hard problems that would deserve careful thought.
And if you're not careful, you could imagine fooling yourself into the wrong answer.
Especially if you think you know the answer or there's an answer you want to get. This is why philosophy is hard, and it's hard to make progress, because in physics, if you keep making mistakes, nature will correct you, right? The data will just come in and say, nope, you've gotten it wrong. But in philosophy, you can go hundreds of years making the same mistakes if you're not careful.
Why This Universe is produced and edited by me, Shalma Wegsman, and our co-host is Dan Hooper. Dan is a professor of physics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the director of the Wisconsin Ice Cube Particle Astrophysics Center. If you like our show and you want to support us, you can join us for as little as $3 a month on Patreon. There you can also get access to exclusive Ask Us Anything segments where you can directly ask Dan and I any of your questions on physics or whatever else. And to find that, just go to patreon.com/whythisuniverse. As always, thanks for listening.